Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Ann Kim. She's contributing editor at Washington Monthly Magazine and author of Poverty for Profit: How Corporations Get Rich Off of America's Poor. Ann, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with, as a way of sort of like introducing this concept that you can actually make money off of poverty. Let's start with Emanuel Savas. This is where, at least sort of, I don't know if you call this a neoliberal turn, but certainly the neoliberal ideology of the marketplace being a more efficient provider of services, sort of like laid the, I guess, the intellectual groundwork for what we've seen in terms of privatization since that era.
Yeah, so Emanuel Savas was a bureaucrat for New York City, and he came up with this idea that, he really popularized this idea that the private sector, anything the government can do, the private sector could do better, faster, cheaper. And he glommed onto this concept after a big snowstorm in New York City that resulted in a ton of snow and the public works department not doing a great job. He decided he would experiment with hiring private garbage trucks to do the same thing. And voila, in his mind, the fact that some of the private garbage collectors did a good job meant that everything that government did could be privatized in the same fashion. And so he became really this evangelist for having government abdicate pretty much everything it can do. Ronald Reagan listened to what he had to say. And then this really took off with the Reagan presidency. During the 1980s, Reagan had two commissions to look into this idea of privatizing government services, turning things over to the private sector. And there were two giant reports, one in 84 and one in 1988. And these reports, one was the Commission on Cutting Fraud and Waste, and the other one was the Commission on Privatization, advocated turning over everything from like air traffic control, Medicare, Medicaid, prisons. And over the last 40 years, a lot of this has actually come to pass. And what's happened as a result of that is you have these gigantic markets for social services that for-profit companies have started swooping in and taking. Now, federal government spends about $900 billion a year on programs that disproportionately or directly impact low-income Americans. A lot of that is healthcare, which we can get into, but that also includes tax credits for working families, SNAP, formerly known as SNOOP, food stamps, housing subsidies, workforce training. All of that has become, each of those things has become a market in its own right because of what started with Ronald Reagan 40 years ago.
Okay, let's start with, you start, we just mentioned the child tax credit, for instance, just in another context. But let's start where you start. This is in Rogers, Arkansas, at a classic used car dealership slash tax prep company, I guess, or store.
Yeah, so this has to do with the federal earned income tax credit, which is one of the federal government's largest anti-poverty programs. In 2022, it returned about $57 billion in tax credits to working families, mainly with kids.
Can you just explain for one moment, because I think people hear tax credits and they don't really understand that it's really like it's a payment. It's not. Right. Refundable tax credit is a very weird way to say a government benefit, essentially.
Oh, that's right. We do a lot of social policy now through the tax code, and we call them credits. Because it is politically more palatable given the politics that we're in right now. So the earned income tax credit is exactly one of those credits you mentioned. You don't have to owe taxes in order to be eligible for the credit. So the refundable part means that even if you have no tax liabilities, cash comes into your pocket. And so
just the fact that we have to use that language is problematic, because all the people who support this thing have absolutely no idea what those words mean. It took me years to understand, wait, it's just a payment. Like calling it a refundable tax credit. Right. it's a reverse tax, essentially, which is what is a government benefit. I mean, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and it has something to do, it's a little digression here, but it has something to do with the politics of poverty, right? It is so steeped in our politics that the quote unquote deserving are the only ones who should get many benefits of any kind. So that's why we have to couch, all the benefits in terms of tax credits and make sure people are working. And that actually adds to the complexity of this particular program. And the complexity is what drives low-income people to have to go to paid tax preparers every year in order to get this benefit to which they are entitled. So this $57 billion that's up for grabs every year, that's an incredibly tempting market, for people who are car dealers, pawn shops, check cashers. They all want a chunk of this money. So what they do, a lot of them are like, just tax prep chains. You could actually just buy yourself a copy of TurboTax and set up a shop if you want to, because there are no regulations on who can be a tax preparer. So you have the chains like Liberty Tax or Jackson Hewitt. And then you've got these guys at Rogers Carmart who will prepare your taxes for you, but also sell you a used car. So when I gave them a call, and that's a chain, by the way, it's a big franchise of Carmart all across the country. And when I gave them a call, that's exactly what they offered to do. What they would charge me would have been about 15% of the average refund for American Family that year, about $2,200. So the fees would have been several $100. And then you go on their website and you can use the rest of your money to put a down payment on some awful used car that they had on their lot. And the idea behind all of these businesses is to capture every single dollar of that benefit that someone has coming to them. Now, the federal government actually went out and surveyed businesses that do this kind of thing, and they found shoe stores that will give you a free pair of shoes if you come in and do your taxes with them. Rent-to-own furniture places that'll offer you discounts on their furniture if you come in and do taxes with them. I mean, you got to admire the entrepreneurship, I guess. But the result is that the efficacy of this benefit is badly damaged by the fact that 10%, 15%, who knows how many billions are being siphoned off every year by these predatory companies that purport to offer service, but are in fact out to grab the dollars that people desperately need for rent, groceries, what have you.
I mean, look, if someone needs to buy a used car, they got to buy a used car. That's what you need to do. But it's the capturing of this 15% vig essentially on this benefit, and that is so incredible. There's there's really two or three different dynamics going on here too. You're also self-selecting people who don't have probably a certain financial literacy. Look, a ton of Americans have very little financial literacy over this stuff. I don't consider myself particularly financially literate either. But if you're going in and paying 15% of your government benefit, you're doing that because you can't figure it out and you're overwhelmed by it. So who knows what the loan is that they're taking out too for that used car? It's like, there's a certain self-selection or I should say, selection process that's going on there. What of the government, and just, to address this, and maybe we'll come back to it later. We'll come back to it later because I'm curious as to the new rollout of the government's tax prep program. We can talk about that at the end because let's move into another sort of like a section. So there's, whatever it is, 6 billion, I guess maybe close to 9 or 10 billion dollars that are just basically going into the hands of people like at the car mart or whatnot to facilitate these people getting what they deserve from the government that we've already paid for, that is already being held against them in the ledger of our politics, as it were. Let's talk about job training. Let's start with international college because these for-profit colleges are sort of a hobby horse of mine. But then I want to talk about the Jobs Corps because I didn't realize there was a problem there too.
Yeah. So, the federal government has had a long history with job training programs that don't particularly work. So International College is a for-profit college, but is somehow eligible to receive federal job training dollars, despite the fact that it barely has any students. It's on a watch list with the Department of Education, and the classes that it offers are things like an online cake decorating class for several $1,000s. But the federal government, if you are, underemployed or unemployed, there's a program called the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, which gives you a voucher to go get training. And you can use your voucher with so-called eligible training providers. And basically, again, it may not be that hard, depending on what state you're in, to become an eligible training provider. Clearly, it was not that hard for International College, given that their online cake baking class is the best that they have to offer. But they go through a process with the state to apply, they get on this list, and then voila, you can get federal training money from people who probably are going to get credentials that are not going to help them in the job market. And it's just yet another boondoggle for these for-profit training providers that are kind of fly-by-night. There's all sorts of odd medical certifications, schools that are out there. Some of it I'm sure is fine, welding class, okay. But the for-profit folks are charging many multiples of what it could cost you to get the same training at a community college.
And we should say this is different from the, sort of like, I know that if you look at any given for-profit university or college, something like anywhere from like 87% to 95% of every dollar that they make from their students comes from a government loan. And so, that ends up being the responsibility of the students, and they get into hock. But none of these private colleges, or very rarely from what I know, provide any type of data as to actually it being effective, either job training. And a lot of people go to the for-profit colleges because they're at a job. They feel like they can't get any further. There's a glass ceiling there, or maybe a lead ceiling, and they think they're going to get ahead. And there's no evidence necessarily that that is the case. So that's a distinction I just want to make clear. But talk about so there's a failure of the government to sort of police who gets these job training dollars. But I also imagine, like, how could it be super profitable for a private enterprise to provide this type of training and also do it fairly? I mean, we get into that area of like, this is something that the government needs to do, because there is no market there if you're actually going to deliver this stuff in a legit fashion.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's like a real failure of both governance and the marketplace. If you're one of these fly-by-night training providers, you're supplying something that's pretty substandard. You're charging the government to do it. If you're a for-profit, it's part of what you do. You get other students who are not coming in on WIOA money, the workforce investment money, but on the loan dollars that you're talking about. And then the lack of data, I think, that's out there really protects a lot of these for-profit providers, because when customers don't know what they're buying, then they don't know how bad it is and they cannot avoid the product. So this lack of transparency and the lack of data is responsible for a lot of the lack of accountability that you're talking about.
All right. So talk about the Job Corps. What is that? What is that program?
So the Job Corps started out like many programs with very good intentions. It was actually part of the original War on Poverty, founded in 1964 by Sergeant Shriver. And the idea was to have residential job training centers where you would have young people who need employment and education to go to kind of these centers, learn a skill, come back and get a job. So it's not really the right model for today, because a lot of these centers are out in rural parts of the country. They provide jobs for the people who work at the centers, but the results have been not great. There have been multiple government investigations into safety concerns. People aren't getting, well, there's a pretty horrendous 2018 report from the Department of Labor's Inspector General that found that a lot of the students who are going into Job Corps centers for training were coming back out and getting exactly the same job that they had when they left. But there's being counted as a success by the program. So there are many, many things that are going wrong here. The whole thing, however, has been privatized from the very start. The people who run the 100 or so Job Corps centers across the country, it's a cabal of about a half a dozen contractors who've literally held on to these contracts for decades. In fact, one of the companies actually boasts on his website that it was one of the original Job Corps contractors from back in the day. So the lack of competition, the breeds mediocrity, which breeds lack of results, which means a disservice to young people who are really looking to this program to get a head start in life. It's about a $1.7 billion program. And not that many kids actually these days are going to Job Corps. So when you look at the per child, per student cost, it's pretty high for the results that we're getting. And that's money that's not going to, say, apprenticeship programs that unions are sponsoring. Or, yeah.
Wait, is it, I mean, when you say like a failure of the market in terms of competition, like, is there a model where this can work? Because I'm not convinced. I mean, well, this is my point is that like, we have government services that are delivered efficiently, that end up costing money, that they don't turn a profit. Like, is it possible that in some of these circumstances, or in many of them, I mean, as I read this, like where this is just not a profitable business. So it's not a question of the market failing in terms of like, because there's no competition, but rather this is not, job training is not necessarily an industry in which you can make profit. And therefore, like the only people you will attract in the private enterprise. Now, it's one thing to say like, okay, the government's going to run this and we're going to hire people from a staffing agency that may be expert at this or something like that. But it feels to me like there may be a problem with the idea that this is actually, there's room for profit to be made in these industries, and that the idea of a private marketplace within these industries is in and of itself a bad idea, just ill-conceived.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I mean, I think that there are some limited areas where the private sector can do a good job. Savas had it right with the garbage collection, for instance, or maybe some data management. But you're absolutely right. When it comes to human services, social services that require a significant amount of investment on the part of mission-driven professionals that really care about whether someone is improving their lives, you can't privatize that. There is no profit in that. Well, there is profit in that if you have contractors who are doing a bad job delivering that service to the government, but the result is going to be terrible for the low-income individuals who are involved in the program. That's the problem, that the government thinks that there's a market that does not exist, but that's enabled these for-profit companies to come on in and grab the profit that they can make by delivering shoddy services and really letting low-income Americans out to dry.
I just, when I hear these stories of privatization, I just remember Katrina and the story of the buses that I had read at the time was that that FEMA had subcontracted the buses so many times. They had hired a contractor who was subcontracted, who then subcontracted out. And at the end of that chain, the only way for that entity to make money was to not deploy the buses unless they were absolutely needed. And by the time you found out that they were absolutely needed, they couldn't get there. And so people couldn't evacuate. Whereas, the government says like, we can afford to lose money on this because our job is to get them out, not necessarily to make it profitable to have the buses take them out. And let's talk about medical stuff. Like the dentistry stories are just horror shows in terms of Medicaid.
Yeah. So dentistry and other Medicaid services that are provided through Medicaid are volume businesses. So we'll talk about dentistry in particular. I had the privilege, so to speak, of going to a dental clinic where the children, who are primarily the patients here, Medicaid covers preventive services for kids, but not so much for adults. And so all of these dental franchises are focused on providing preventive dental care for children. And they do it in a factory-like setting. So the clinic that I visited had, instead of like the one chair in the one examining room, they had about a half a dozen chairs arranged like spokes in a wheel. So they would have 6 patients, 6 kids at a time in these chairs being treated. And that was kind of the whole attitude of this volume-driven business. And what's happened is that there have been numerous federal prosecutions over the years of dentists who've performed unnecessary procedures on kids. So one dentist in North Carolina, he performed 17 root canals on a 3-year-old. He was prosecuted for that. In Colorado, they had to ban the use of what are called papoose boards, which are boards with Velcro restraints, because they were performing multiple unnecessary procedures on children. But the only way they could do that was to tie the kids down. So they can do multiple pulpotomies, taking out root canals basically, or crowns or fillings. There's just been so many abuses. And the reason why this happens is because Medicaid doesn't pay that much. And there are a lot of reasons why mainstream dentists don't treat Medicaid patients. So what that has done is created a vacuum, which has allowed this kind of subset of dentistry chains, many of them owned by private equity, to kind of swoop in there and grab the market for themselves. And they discovered that they can make a profit through this volume model and through overbilling, fraud. The one chain that I went to go visit was owned by a company called Benevis, which a couple of years later settled with the federal government for $24 million for Medicaid fraud because they overbilled for procedures that were unnecessary on the children that they treated. And that's kind of typical.
How much of this is also this, maybe you can speak to how conscious or deliberate it is, but by people in government over the past few decades wanting government to work less not work as well for people, right? Where you have these kind of complicated hoops to go through, or you can even look at the Sam brought up the now direct filing system that was rolled out this year by the Biden administration for your taxes. Why did people have to pay TurboTax $150 for their state and federal returns prior to this, except to give the company a lot of money, but also to make people feel like, oh man, I've got to shell out money to pay my taxes instead of the government just giving me the tools to do so, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really great point with this. You know, on the one hand, the conservative right is saying, oh, well, business can do things better than government can. And then on the other hand, what they're doing is using that to both shrink the size of government and, as you point out, to show how ineffective government is by forcing you to have to shell out money to have to deal with them. So it's like a multiple front war on government that the conservative right is waging with its tactics of privatization, but also attacks on government generally, and undermining the efficacy of government on so many levels. And I think social services, and especially when we're talking about low-income Americans who are particularly vulnerable and particularly prone to be pawns in a lot of political debates that are racialized, that prey on kind of the worst instincts that we have toward who is deserving and not in this country. And the conservative right is using that as the wedge to undermine government more generally. I think you're absolutely right.
Right.
All right. Yeah. So I in terms of the Medicaid, how do you deal with that? Like, where is that problem happening? Like, what is the what creates that?
Yeah, that is a really complex question, actually. There's a broader problem with the privatization of Medicaid. So in about half of states, Medicaid is run by private for-profit insurance companies who get paid what's called capitated basis, like a set amount per patient. So basically you end up kind of rationing care. So that's happening in about half of states. So Iowa, for instance, did this back in 2015. And one thing that the auditors in Iowa discovered was that illegal denials of care rose by 900% in the years following the privatization of Medicaid. So one obvious solution would be to kind of stop the privatization train when it comes to Medicaid. When it comes to stuff like dentistry, when you have the providers that are in this space, it's not going to be enough just to raise the rates, unfortunately, because what will happen initially in something like dentistry is that the rates go up, the Medicaid dentists will just make more. because you're not getting other dentists to come in there and provide the services. Community health centers, I think, is one option for providing quality care or better quality care to children who need it, probably in the dentistry space and others. But it's a really multifaceted problem that probably would take another 3 hours to talk about. But I think the first couple steps here are to stop the privatization where we can, and to really take a hard look at why in certain sectors this is happening.
So, I mean, it sounds like the sort of the most direct solution is a Medicaid for all or a Medicare for all type of program where you would have to require dentists and medical providers to, at the very least, I mean, people can debate about whether you need to get rid of private insurance in this instance, but at the very least, you'd have to sort of require 80% of the people who walk through your door have to be enrolled or be paying through a Medicare for all or a Medicaid for all or single payer healthcare program, so that you couldn't sort of sequester these groups of people and create a sort of factory business model for them.
Yeah, I mean, you got to fix the supply side. You're absolutely right. I mean, so long as you have Medicaid doctors and Medicaid dentists and that industry that does segregate the Medicaid patient population, you're never going to have a solution for the disparities that so many people face around this when it comes to healthcare.
Let's talk about, and we have this problem in dialysis, I guess, too.
Dialysis is, yeah. So I think about the poverty profiteers in kind of three big buckets. It's chapter on each kind of industry, but they're the skimmers, and those are the EITC folks we're talking about. They're the monopolist contractors, and those are the Job Corps contractors we just discussed. And then this third category of opportunists, industries that make most of their money from persistent poverty and its consequences, such as kidney failure. And that's where dialysis comes in. The disproportionate number of people who have kidney failure in the United States are low income and or minority because of these decades of health disparities that we've been talking about. The vast majority of dialysis treatments given in the United States are provided by just two companies, the duopoly of Fresenius and DaVita. And just to give you an example of how much money were involved here, DaVita made about $12 billion in 2023, and 2/3 of that money came from Medicare. So the government actually pays for the vast majority of dialysis treatment in the United States. And again, these two companies have chased out or consolidated nonprofit providers. It's a volume business because the dialysis centers have chairs that need to be filled as often as possible. And they've been prosecuted for things like paying kidney doctors to send patients their way instead of perhaps referring them to life-saving transplants. 5-year survival rate for transplant, 90%. 5-year survival rate for being on dialysis, 40%. Where is the money though? Dialysis.
What's to prevent the U.S. government from setting up dialysis centers? I mean, this is one of those things where I would imagine there's not much of a difference in treatment between a dialysis center in one part of New York versus another part of New York. I mean, dialysis is dialysis. There's not a lot of moving part. I don't know if there's moving parts, but you get my
yeah.
There's not a lot of room for disparate levels of treatment in terms of the dialysis.
Well, actually, there can be. The SEIU has actually filed suit against dialysis providers in California, I think it's DaVita, for increasing the speed of the treatment disproportionately against minority patients, and thereby causing high blood pressure, heart problems, things like that. There was a complaint that was filed. And of course, the faster you do the treatment, the more patients you can have, right? So there are disparities in treatment. I think actually the solution here is not so much at the dialysis center level, but at the prevention of getting people on dialysis in the first place. We've got to fix the root problems that are leading to the trifecta of diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease that put so many people on the path to kidney failure. You can take away their patients and also provide the better care. But if we can fix those health disparities, you can stop the power of the duopolies. in a much more effective way and really improve the quality of life, because you don't want to be on dialysis.
Well, I get that, but I mean, some people, I mean,
Oh,
some
yeah.
people are, you know, you have kidney cancer, and as you get older, you have one kidney and it becomes, you know, and it fails. I mean, there's going to be dialysis on some
Sure.
level or another. It just seems like that is a perfect example, again, of like, you could have people who cut corners, but
Yeah.
in terms of like, there is, you know, it seems to me there's a baseline of quality, and there's not much divergence above that baseline. You know, why couldn't government set up these centers?
Yeah, I mean, we have decided, though, you know, as a country, that we're going to pay private dialysis providers through Medicare. That's the biggest obstacle.
All right. Well, let's touch on housing, because that's a big issue that is increasingly problematic in our society. Housing, we see another iteration of this, where we went from building public housing to essentially a voucher program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of like the dentists and in other places, now we have Section 8 landlords. And you can find YouTube videos, actually, of people who talk about how they can make a lot of money with Section 8 housing, because, you know, the payments are regular. There's a wait list because there's a shortage of affordable housing out there. There's one guy named Peter Harris who allegedly taped a series of lectures with Donald Trump for Trump University on commercial real estate. Had tips like, you know, don't have garbage disposals or screen doors, you know, just get, and that kind of tells you that the quality of housing provided by real estate management companies that specialize in affordable housing, Section 8 housing in this way, it's probably not the kind of, you know, housing that you would want to live in typically. And the other problem is that we haven't managed to break concentrated poverty, because again, the landlords who are in this space pretty much concentrate themselves in low-income areas. And the purpose of vouchers was to try to help people move out of high poverty areas into areas that have a little bit more economic diversity. And that hasn't happened because of the capture of the marketplace, again, by for-profit providers that focus on this market, exploit it for all it's worth, provide subpar products, and treat the tenants poorly.
And what about, say, shelters, for example, as it relates to unhoused people? Is that in part, you know, affected by some of this, I guess, planned inefficiency?
Yeah, I don't address the homeless, the unhoused population, and the solutions for them specifically in the book. I know New York City has had some serious problems with contracting with entities that are providing, you know, or not providing housing for people who don't have it. There needs to be kind of a top to bottom reform of how we provide. We need to provide more affordable housing. We need to provide affordable housing in parts of the communities that are not just certain areas, but diffused throughout. We need to look at zoning. We need to look at land use. We need to be more generous in the amount of help that we give people, and we need to give a lot more people help, because the percentage of low-income people who have access to subsidies, who are eligible for it, is minuscule compared to the need.
So what, in the end, in your mind, like we have the policy prescriptions on some level, right? I mean, how do these changes happen? Because it seems to me like there has to be a change in an ideological framework for an administration to come in, let's say, and begin to make these changes within each of these silos. Like, it's not, you know, it's conceivable that, you know, somebody might wake up one day at an agency that oversees some of this and say, there's a more efficient way of doing this, but there seems to have to be an ideological change that goes away from, you know, Reagan saying the most dangerous words in the English language are "I'm from the government, I'm here to help," to, frankly, Clinton and their initiative to make a leaner, meaner government. Because the idea that this shrinks government is also absurd. If you're wasting 10 to 15% on the earned income tax credit, you're not shrinking government. You're just basically, this is, you know, this is what sort of like classical neoliberalism is. It's getting a hold and influencing the government to fund certain industries and certain players within, industries. What is the broad ideological change that has to happen, if that's what you think has to happen to make a change, a wholesale change across the board?
Yeah, I mean, good luck trying to get any politician to embrace this, but the ideological change has to be an embrace of government again. We got to get off the privatization train that we've all been on for 40 years, not us on this call, but government in general. And this idea that government can't perform. And I think that's been pounded into the citizens' heads for so many years that it's really difficult to come up with a message that's going to begin resonating. I do think that the direct file program that we've been talking about is one way to kind of demonstrate to American people that, look, the government can do something for you that is effective, efficient, will save you money, and get you the refund that you deserve. Unfortunately, that program only reached about 140,000 households last year. And
well, that was a pilot program, but now they're rolling it out for everybody, right?
They are, but the conservatives are trying to shut it down. And companies have actually spent tens of millions of dollars. ProPublica had a great investigation about the amount of money that Intuit and HR Block have spent over the years to have legislation to block the IRS from providing either a direct file, and they've also opposed any sort of tax simplification, so to lessen the demand so that people can do their taxes on their own. So we're up against some pretty powerful forces here that are determined to keep these structures in place, shrink the government even more. Project 2025, by the way, has privatization practically on every other page about what they want to do. And they have horrific plans for slashing social services, handing more and more over to the private sector. And so if they get their hands on government next year, we're going to see a lot more of what's happening than less. And so it could become even more difficult to turn things around if we're not careful this fall.
Ann Kim, contributing editor at Washington Monthly Magazine. The book is Poverty for Profit, How Corporations Get Rich Off of America's Poor. We didn't even talk about private prisons. We've talked about that in the past in general, both in terms of like the services that come into prisons and just the entire private prison racket. Nor did we reference, but I feel obligated to, the Chicago parking meters story from 2015, which was also a prime example of just the horrible ideas behind privatization of these things. A really important book. Really appreciate it. We'll put a link to it at majority.fm.
Thank you so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.